And we're off. All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Allan Friedman. If you've ever heard of an SBOM, there's a decent chance that's my fault. If you've ever had to make an SBOM, that probably was my fault. And so I'm sorry about that. I just wrapped up on Friday 10 years as the US government, being one of the US government leads for supply chain security, and been looking around for what's the next problem that we're going to have to solve together. And I think a big thing that we're gonna have to tackle is going to be hardware supply chain and HBOM. So, oops, there we go. What are we going to have to tackle through today? Either you could go down to a village and hack some cool stuff, or we could talk about the security risks. And one of the problems that we're gonna have to be dealing with is actually that the government's going to make some problems. And it's gonna make some problems for some good reasons, but we're gonna collectively have to figure out how to deal with them. We're gonna talk about transparency and why it's sort of the sine qua non for anything we have to do in security. We'll go over what an HBOM actually is, and then how we're gonna build it. And for those of you who are like, does anyone really care about where my semiconductors come from? I think this is sort of one of the foundational things. We are going to be seeing this a lot more. There's a Forbes cover story just in April. There have been a bunch of stories like this. So whether or not you believe it's a problem, one thing to know is that a whole bunch of other people think it's a problem, and that's sometimes even worse. So we're going to have to understand where our semiconductors come from. Where do our chips come from? All right, I'm assuming if you're in this room, you have some idea what a semiconductor is, some idea what a chip does. The important thing, takeaway here, is there are lots of chips in everything, right? There are lots of things. Things contain many, many chips. There is an infinite amount more detail, and I believe the current numbers are $3 trillion behind that giant blow up of here's all my chips. And it's not just a bunch of stuff, it's a bunch of organizations that are managing that stuff. And those organizations themselves don't actually do the work when their name's on the side of the box all the time. So who here works for an OEM? Okay. Who here works for an OEM that does at least non-trivial contract manufacturing? Yeah, we've got a number of folks, right? You know, that's just the way the industry works. Now, there is some good news, which is you cannot build a thing without a BOM already, right? Everyone in this room who's in manufacturing, you guys have lots of bills of material, and you spend a lot of time on fancy software to help manage them and things like that. So we've been getting better at tracking our supply chains from a logistical perspective. Anyone know who that is, by the way? Shout it out. No one went to business school. All right, that's Allan Deming. He is the father of modern supply chain. And when I say the father of modern supply chain, he was doing this in the 1940s, in the late 1940s. He helped Japan build up and create the manufacturing powerhouse that they've become. But what don't always pay close enough attention from the manufacturing perspective to where we actually got the stuff, right? It's one thing to say, my wine's got grapes. It's another thing to say, my wine's made with Chardonnay grapes. But is it actually the purest stuff that you're paying for, or is it just sparkling counterfeits, right? Can you show that it came from where you think it is? So what are the risks, right? One of them is counterfeits. Now, we're at a hacker conference, which means that almost every one of you has illegally downloaded songs and music and TV, and that's great. But counterfeits actually sometimes have much greater implications, right? So the Senate Armed Services Committee thought it was such a big problem, they spent a year trying to figure out where are all the counterfeits that are in the DoD, Defense National Security Supply Chain. There are vulnerabilities, and we know they're important because some of them even have names. A lot of them take advantage of the really dangerous attack vectors in these software-hardware interactions, so really enabling unprivileged software to run. And I won't run through all of them. Some of you have been involved in finding them, Larry, but we know that they are tackling a large portion of the supply chain. And in fact, we also know there's active tampering in the middle of it. There's interceptions where people say, I've shipped one thing and something else got to the final destination. Now for me, the existential moment around this had nothing to do with semiconductors. It was about what happened to a pallet full of pagers before it hit southern Lebanon. So we've been talking about supply chain attacks for a while. It's not always true what we claim, right? I was going to make a little sticker of Bloomberg brand grains of rice. We do know that sometimes the attacks are overstated. And even recently, a month or two ago, there was a story in Reuters that said, hey, implants on solar inverters, and well, or just undocumented stuff that we didn't pay attention to. But again, the core takeaway here, step one, is we're going to have to start paying a lot more attention. Countries aren't the most important thing. In fact, I would argue countries are not a very good predictor of risk, and it's a little easy to slip into casual racism. But we do have on the books this notion of a foreign ownership controlling interest, and that shapes a large part of compliance. For sanctions, for regulations, tariffs are now a thing again, so we have to track that things come from for tariffs, and that has to fit in your modeling approach. And what we know, now that I'm finally outside of the government, I get to make fun of the government again, is that government gonna government, right? And regulations are already here. There are rules that directly go to the telecommunications sector saying you cannot use certain things. There's something called Section 5949. If you know about it, I'm sorry. And we're paying a lot more attention now on the outbound side of our supply chain, right? Congress just passed a law that said we have to be very careful where our most advanced chips are going, but we need to spend a little more time of where they're coming from. And even then, we've got policies on the book, and guess what? They're bad policies already. The Bureau of Industry and Security is one of the most dangerous and scary parts of the US government that you've never heard of. They passed a rule in January under a process that started in the previous Trump administration that says no car sold in the United States starting in 2029 can have any Chinese components. Does anyone think that we will be able to build a car in 2029 without anything from China? No. So we need a better way. And some people are starting to get it, right? I'm not picking on Congressman Moulton for any reason other than saying, hey, the challenge is we don't know what the supply chain looks like, and we need better visibility. So the goal of HBOM is to use visibility and transparency to better understand where things come from the customer perspective, from the downstream perspective. So we're talking about chips, but really what we're talking about is how we are using our chips in our manufacturing process. Now, that's still a pretty big scope, so let's try to narrow it a little further. We want to focus on security, right? We're addressing that security kinds of risk. There are other reasons that we want to pay attention to our supply chain, including human rights, sustainability, to name two different areas of active regulation. We want to focus primarily on semiconductors, right? Trying to tackle all of hardware for plastics is pretty hard. And by semiconductors, I'll tell you what, let's try to take, our capacitors off the table. Let's take our batteries off the table when they're not processing active data. And so the term that is often used is an active component. I like language from the payment card industry, which says, do you store, process, or transmit data? Great. Then we bump into issues around confidentiality, integrity, availability. And we just acknowledge that there are lots of other supply chain issues out there, and we're ultimately going to need to integrate into them. So for me, the philosophy behind the modern BOM movement is the idea that there is some set of known badness. And we're going to not predefine what that is, but we're going to start with the idea that there is a set of known badness, and we want to be able to map that into the things that we care about. I would argue, hopefully convincingly since I was there, that this sort of kicked off with the SBOM movement, right? It wasn't a unique idea at the time that we should know what's in our supply chains, but it was built around the idea that it's a real shame if we're selling things to critical infrastructure, to national security, without knowing what the software is. And rather than go down to the fine grains of specific risks, say, know what you have and be able to map it to the risks. Are you worried about sole maintainer open source? Great, look for it in your BOM. Are you just worried about CVEs? Fantastic. So what the BOM model does is it creates a data layer that is independent of our risk management layer, but it exists to support that layer. So we're using modularity so that we're not locking either side in. This is the point of being flexible and resilient as we build our plans. So we focus at the bottom on what's in there, and then as we get up, we start to care about what are the risks that we focus on. What do we need from this transparency layer? We're going to need common approach or approaches for tracking the data. Needs to be interoperable. Rather than rushing straight to the technical standards, and I used to be an engineer, I wasn't a very good one, but I used to be one, so my temptation is always to say, well, let's build it. And then after you build it, you're like, oh, damn, we forgot a use case. And the people that actually would put money into using this don't want it. Or we have a plan for a standard. It will take us 23 years to build it. Come back after we've all grown gray and dusty in conference rooms. That's not great. And so making sure that we have this transparency layer is key. The other thing, as we start thinking about the components, is we're going to have to pay attention to who touched things along the way, right? Who had control of the physical stuff. It's very hard to take a hash of a DIM. So I can't prove that no one touched it just by looking at the traditional tools we have for integrity, which means if we care about it to a great deal and we're worried about attackers actually touching something or interfering across the movement of goods, we're going to need to take a better idea of this progress. Now, I think about half the people in this room spend a lot of time thinking about SBOMs. HBOM is different from SBOM, but it rhymes a little bit. So what are the similarities? I've talked about separating data from risk. I've talked about the need for building this to meet a diverse space. Everything from, super rapid turn CI/CD pipelines and modern software from data centers to legacy energy equipment and national security systems. I've worked with a team based in Hill Air Force Base here in Utah, or in Utah in the US, and they're doing DevSecOps for the A-10. The big plane that moves really slowly, it's built around a giant gun. Right, so that plane was built in the 1970s, and they're doing DevSecOps for its modern software maintenance. The core here is that there's no one-size-fits-all for either SBOM or HBOM. There are some differences, though. As I've already tried to push us to, that compliance is going to be coming. And in fact, I'd argue compliance is going to be the primary driver here. If you think that the US government or other major governments will not pass a law about country of origin for physical supply chain in the next 6 years, and you can convince me, I'll find another project, right? This is something that is going to be driven by the government, but that means it's really important that we as a community tell policymakers how to implement it in a meaningful and efficient way. So we're front-running regulation. The supply chains are a little longer. They're more chaotic. Some of you have probably had the experience of having to try to buy something of which there is a shortage, only to find out that there are some very clever business people who have figured out how to corner the market for very short periods of time and predict scarcity, driving up the costs. They're like, all right, well, do I have to go rewire the PCB or can I just pay for it? Verification is going to be a lot more expensive. It's going to be possible, and in fact, I predict that the market is going to grow. If you're looking about what to start now as a tech startup, my recommendation is that you get into hardware verification. It's a very specialized market, very high margins, needs lots of smart people who can be creative and take advantage of modern technology like robotics and learning systems to do it at scale. And if you do start that business, please buy me a dinner at like Black Hat 3 years from now. I think you'll be able to buy me a very nice one. There are going to be different risk models, and so we're going to need different levels of assurance. For SBOM, we set out explicitly to say an SBOM is an SBOM is an SBOM. Now, it's not quite that simple, but we did not want to have levels of assurance baked in. It makes things more complex and more expensive. We're definitely going to need to do that, right? The costs of tracking this will vary. And so being able to say consumer grade IoT gets a certain type of assertion, certain types of data tracking. And as we move up to say medical devices, which are safety critical, and then telecom infrastructure, which is safety critical and an active target from foreign adversaries, and then ultimately into aerospace and national security, we're going to want to ratchet up the amount of data we need and the support that goes into making attestations about this data. So it's got to be cross-sector. I'm focusing on 5 sectors: defense, critical infrastructure, telecom, automotive, medical device, and of course, what sector touches on every other critical infrastructure sector is IT. All right, we don't have a lot of time to do our murder board red to me exercise, but there are reasons not to do this. One of you can argue and say, hey, listen, yeah, government's going to talk about it, but I don't think this is a real threat. Okay, we can actually drill down and have a conversation and start documenting these are types of attacks that we're worried about and what's realistic and not, and what's the best way to defend against them. If you're worried about someone tracking your supply chain, you can just say, hey, I'm just going to put a person next to my container all the time. Right? There are other ways that we can explore what the risk would be. 2 is that this is going to fundamentally undermine corporate competitiveness in the manufacturing industry. No one wants to tell their customer about their supplier, because then their customer will just go directly to the supplier, right? Being a middleman is where you make the money. So if you want to protect that as competitive data. There are a couple ways that we can deal with this. One of them is around making sure that we have the ability to attest reliably certain properties in an auditable way. so that we're not the data is not going to be public, and it may not even be shared with your customer until someone has to prove something. All right. Good news is we have a starting point. My friend Tommy here helped with this. CISA, working with some industry folks from the comm sector and the IT sector, wrote a framework. A framework is a wonderful idea. It helps us get a picture of what something's going to look like without any responsibility to build that system. It was based on the software bill of materials work. This is a great starting point. It was published in 2023, and it describes some of the basic roles and a taxonomy so that we have a starting point to do this work, right? They set it up to say, we know we can't do the work now, but we want to have a starting point. One of the great things about this work is they said, here are the use cases we're aiming for. So we don't have to start from scratch. We're worried about compliance. Notice that's first and foremost. We're worried about security, both from risks of vulnerabilities, but also from active attacks and loss of control due to jurisdiction. But we're also going to remember what happened to the manufacturing world in 2020 and make sure that we're building in a certain amount of data around availability so that everyone who needs to plan and know their overall risk. And I think this is going to be one of the more important side benefits, is allowing us to understand our overall exposure. The same way that a bunch of SBOMs together can help us understand that open source project is something we're all really dependent on. No one knows anything about it, and it's got 2 maintainers, and they appear to be getting ready to have an exit. There are some gaps. Oh boy, are there gaps. One of them is going to be, how do we link hardware and software? This is a known hard problem. What does provenance look like? What does auditing look like? That was one of the things we never solved with SBOM, is really getting into how do I know, especially if I have a third party that cares about it. There are existing standards out there. They're decent starts. I certainly won't say anything bad about them on stage. But for me, the core takeaway is no one standard is equipped to solve this problem today, and almost certainly won't be. There are too many different types of data that we're going to have to deal with. So bring them all together is going to be difficult. And since I've been on stage for 22 minutes at a security conference in 2025, we may actually have to use some AI here. We've got a data universe over here, we've got a data universe over here. Rather than letting humans link them, this seems like something that large language models are pretty good at. So we've got some next steps. We're gonna need to find an institutional home for this. We're gonna have to get some funding for it, right? It's not gonna be brought to you by your friends in the government right now. And we're gonna convene. We're gonna work on making it international. This is something that definitely cannot be a US issue. HBOM is mentioned in the Cyber Resilience Act in US, or in the EU. It is part of the Korean National Cybersecurity Strategy. Our friends in the Japanese Ministry of Economics, Trade and Industry have been poking at this. Oops. So, if you want to know more, hbom.tech, sign up for a mailing list, come and help build what I think is going to be a very hard problem to tackle, but a very important solution. We'll have to have everyone at the table, especially security people. So I'd love to chat more if you're interested. I think that's my time.